Hey everybody, Billy Obenauer here, joining you to continue our lessons on Bateman and Konopaske's management textbook. In this lesson, we're going to be moving forward into chapter 13 of their text, which focuses on communicating. Okay, so let's get started. As we move through the text, we're going to discuss important advantages of two-way communication. We're going to look to identify communication problems that we want to avoid. We're going to discuss when and how to use different channels of communication. We're going to give examples of how we can become better senders and receivers of information. We're going to talk about how to improve downward, upward, and horizontal communication. We're going to summarize how to work with the company Grapevine. And then finally, we're going to describe what a boundaryless organization is and what the advantages of that type of organization are. But before we move through all those objectives, let's start by defining communication. And communication is the transmission of information and meaning from one party to another through the use of shared symbols. Okay, so what that basically means is every time we send a message to someone else, we're communicating. And an important thing to remember here is that not all communication is intentional. Sure, sometimes we may be sending an email or speaking or delivering a speech, and in these cases we are trying to communicate a message to others. But other times it may not be intentional at all. Something as simple as not holding a door for another person or not replying to an email quickly also sends information as well. So we need to think about all these different ways that we can communicate as we go through this lesson. Now this model here shows us what intentional communication looks like. And intentional communication starts out with a message that we have to deliver. Okay, and in the model here, that message that has to get delivered is the intended meaning that person A, the sender, wants to convey. So person A is going to take that meaning and they're going to encode it into some types of symbols. Okay, these symbols might be words. Maybe they take the message and they speak the message. Maybe they take the message and they send an email. Or maybe the message is just a very simple hello and they wave hi to someone, but they figure out how they're going to encode that message. Okay, then based upon how they're going to encode it and what type of message it is, they pick a communication channel and send the message to person B, the receiver. Person B now has to decode the message. Okay, they need to read the message, they need to interpret the message, they need to gain some sense of understanding. And through that decoding process, person B, the receiver, is going to come up with what they think is their perceived meaning from the message. Then finally, person B is going to provide feedback to person A. And you might be thinking, well, the receiver doesn't always respond to the sender. And you'd be 100% correct in thinking that. But even a non-response provides feedback. If I send an email to my boss and my boss doesn't respond, they've provided me feedback. The feedback they've provided is that my email wasn't very important to them. So we need to remember that when we receive a message, our response or lack of response continually provides feedback to the original sender. Now, not all communication incorporates the type of feedback loop that we talked about on the previous slide. Sometimes we have what we call one-way communication. And one-way communication occurs when one party delivers a message to another party without an opportunity for them to respond. So if you think about a presidential address that you might watch on TV, where the President of the United States is speaking to the people of America, well, there's not really an option for you to raise your hand and ask a question or give your feedback. That's an example of one-way communication. And in our organizations, we see one-way communication from time to time. We may see memos that come out from our corporate offices, or we may see announcements from our CEOs. And this one-way communication, it can be hampered by noise. Okay, because there is no feedback loop, there's not really an opportunity or a great opportunity for us to clarify any questions. So the context of the message, other things that are going on when the message takes place, can all change the way we interpret it. So for example, if you're in a situation where your CEO sends out a memo saying that we're going to have reduced budgets next year, and you've just had your budget cut on 3 different projects, those budget cuts that you've just experienced are some noise. They're shaping how you're going to interpret this message. Whereas if you've had all your budgets met, if you've received all the resources you need, and then you hear about budget cuts, you're going to interpret that message very differently. So that's an example of how noise can influence the way we interpret one-way communication. In contrast to one-way communication, we can also engage in two-way communication in our organizations. And in two-way communication, we do have that feedback loop where the sender invites communication from the receiver and is receptive to that communication. Okay, and what I mean by that when I say they're receptive is they don't just send a message and say, hey, let me know what you think about this, but they truly listen to what you think after you send that reply. Okay, sometimes we see managers do things where they'll send a message and then they'll say, let me know if you have any questions or let me know your thoughts on this. And then anytime someone asks a question or raises a thought, they really shoot them down or they belittle them or they do something else to prevent future questions or thoughts from coming in their direction. That's not really an example of two-way communication. That's kind of like fake two-way communication. In real two-way communication, you allow people to respond and to provide their feedback, and you interpret it and respond in a meaningful way. Now, communication is open to a variety of different pitfalls, and we tend to see problems in communication in various stages, including encoding, decoding, and transmission. So when you think about encoding, maybe we don't choose the right words in our communication. Recently, I was telling a friend how I thought, they didn't share a lot of information very often, and I said something to the effect of, you hold your cards very close to the vest. Well, that's a reference to the game of poker. My friend comes from a culture where they don't play poker, so it actually became a somewhat confusing interaction because my friend wasn't familiar with that phrase. So that was an encoding issue on my part. Sometimes when we're decoding, we mishear something. We might miss a word, and missing that word, not hearing that word, or not reading a specific word in a sentence may change the meaning of the communication entirely. And then we also can have transmission issues. Okay, maybe a memo gets lost, maybe an email goes into the spam folder, or maybe we entered the wrong email address by a letter and the email is lost in cyberspace. All these different examples are ways that we can have transmission problems in communication as well. Now, perceptions and filtering also influence communication. And what we mean by perceptions are sometimes different factors can influence how we interpret information. So let's say I'm asking for a day off, and it's really difficult for my organization to give me the day off, but I really want it, okay? And I don't really care how difficult it is for them. And my boss says, I'd really rather not give you the day off, and here are the reasons why, but I suppose if you really need it, you can have it. Well, I perceive that as, oh, okay, they're okay with it. They said I can take it. When really that's not necessarily the message that they were sending. But because I'm biased and I need the day off or I want the day off for something that's important to me, I perceive them as being more willing to allow me to take the day off than they really were. Okay, now filtering deals with how we send the information, okay, how we encode the information. And basically what happens with filtering is we don't necessarily lie, but we may keep certain pieces of information away from the receiver. Okay, and I'm going to give you an example here where my mother was in the hospital and I went to visit her, and I had rode down on my motorcycle 3 or 4 hours to get to the hospital, and my mom hates my motorcycle. So before I went to the hospital, I quick dropped my bike off at her house, dropped my helmet there, grabbed my stepdad's truck, and went over to the hospital. And I walked in, and she said, first thing she said, "Thank you for coming. You didn't take your bike here, did you?" Well, I said, I didn't say yes, I didn't say no. I said, "Mom, if I took my bike, wouldn't I have a motorcycle helmet?" And she goes, "Oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense, right?" And I did that because I didn't want her to be stressed out, okay? And I didn't exactly lie, but I didn't exactly give her accurate information, right? So that's an example of filtering. We see filtering in business in quite a few ways. So we may give someone a report and leave out context. So maybe our sales numbers are really great, but they have nothing to do with what we did. Okay, sales numbers were driven by an event that's local that nobody in our corporate office is going to know about. And we just happen to forget to tell them about that local event that drove our sales. Okay, maybe we have something happen where our operational efficiency increased tremendously okay, but it increased because of something that was really outside of our control, and we didn't bother to mention that when we reported out those figures. Those would be examples of filtering as well. Now, there are a variety of reasons that we can have mistaken perceptions in communication. Okay, sometimes these things happen completely by accident where the sender is just giving mixed signals. They don't even realize they're doing it. Maybe they're delivering positive news. They mean to be positive, but they just had something terrible happen, and it's influencing, their body language and other factors, so they're sending a mixed signal. Okay, sometimes different people just interpret the same information differently because they come from different frames of reference. Sometimes there are cross-cultural differences where language means different things in one culture as it does from another. And we can't control all these things. But what we can do as managers is we can try to think about strategies to avoid these types of issues. Okay, so the first strategy would be to try to make sure that the receiver is really paying attention to the message. So if we're having a conversation, I may be working to make eye contact with you. I may ask some questions that kind of clarify that you're engaged in the dialogue. I'll go through different strategies to make sure that you're paying attention to the message that's sent and that you're getting kind of the key points in there. Okay, I'm also going to consider your frame of reference and try to attempt to communicate the message in a way that keeps your frame of reference in mind. Okay, so when I'm talking to students about education, I remember I grew up and came up through the educational system at a very different time when education was done differently from how it is today. So I can't communicate like back in my day when I was in school. I have to think about what does education look like today and communicate within that framework. Okay. We also want to take steps to minimize potential perceptual errors and eliminate improper signals here. Okay. So this goes back to understanding frame of reference, making sure that I'm being deliberate in terms of how I'm communicating, making sure that my body language and my facial expressions are matching up with the words that I'm delivering, that type of thing. Okay, and then finally, we want to be consistent in our messages. Okay, many employees talk about terrible bosses. I can think of terrible bosses I've had in the past who deliver two competing messages. Okay, you'll hear messages like, we used to hear messages like, you need to make sure you have enough people on the sales floor to take care of all the customers, while then within 5 minutes also getting a message about how we need to cut hours and reduce payroll. Now, as a manager, I'm sitting here and I'm saying, well, which is the priority, right? Because I can send everybody home, but if I send everybody home, I don't have anybody to take care of the customers. But you told me to make sure the customers are taken care of, and you told me to send everybody home. So what do you want? Those are inconsistent messages. We need to be careful that we have consistency across the messages that we're delivering. Now, as I've been talking through communication examples, I've used a lot of examples of oral communication. And oral communication is when we speak to people face-to-face, on the telephone, through like WebEx or Skype or Zoom. Okay, those are all examples of oral communication. And oral communication has some real benefits. Okay, we get immediate feedback. It's direct. We can ask clarifying questions right away. We can confirm understanding right away. Okay, the receiver can kind of sense sincerity, right? Because they're also, getting other signals. They're reading body language, reading facial expressions. You can be more persuasive in oral communication because you have the opportunity to basically ask questions about people's doubts, right? And try to take those doubts away. And a lot of times it can be less expensive, okay? It depends on the type of oral communication that you're using and the format, but very often it can be less expensive to simply talk to someone or talk to them on telephone, right? Then we also have written communication, and written communication is exactly what it sounds like: text message, emails, memos, letters, anything basically where we've documented and written out the communication. One of the benefits of written communication is you don't necessarily have that I misspoke moment, right? Because you have the opportunity to read your email over and over before you send it. You can have someone take a look at it for you and make sure that everything is good in it. Okay, it provides a permanent record of the communication. Now, this can be both positive and negative, right? Because I may want to be able to go back and say, hey, this is the message that I delivered to you back in June. This is what I'm referring to. But if I made a mistake in that message, there's also a permanent record of that message, right? All right, the message remains consistent. All right, one of the things that I love about email is that I will often go back to email and send almost the same email to someone that I sent them a few weeks prior, right, to make sure that the message I'm giving them is consistent. I'll also look at emails that I've sent to one student before sending emails to another student, because I want to make sure that I'm treating my students equitably, and I'll say, hey, I want to make sure that my message is consistent from student A to student B to student C and so on. And then also you have time to process, okay? Sometimes you get an email or you get a text message and you have to pause and you have to remember, you know what? This is not an emergency. I don't need to respond right away. I'm going to take a day to think about it, okay? And that helps you provide a more thoughtful response. If I'm on a telephone call or I'm in person, face-to-face with somebody, and they say something that is a little bit bothersome to me, I don't have the opportunity to really just not respond, because that in itself is sending a message. Now, the effectiveness of your communication is going to be determined in part by the channel that you choose. Okay, so how do we choose the right communication channel? Well, part of that is going to depend on your situation, and we can't give you an exhaustive list of situations here, all right, but we're going to walk through a few examples and talk about why we would choose different channels for each situation. So for starters, maybe you're asking your boss for a pay raise. Definitely want to do this in a face-to-face discussion. Number one, you're going to be more persuasive, because it's a lot harder to say no to somebody asking for a pay raise if it's an in-person or face-to-face discussion than via email or text message. All right, two, we want to be able to respond to any concerns that they have. We want to be able to respond to those concerns immediately so they can't build upon those concerns. Three, you can read their facial expressions, read their body language, okay, and then you can kind of manage their perceptions of the situation, which helps you make sure that they don't see you as somebody who's being greedy or asking for too much. Okay, next situation, we're confirming an appointment with a customer, simple text message or email. That's going to be written every day, okay, because this should be a 2-second process. Hey, are we still on for tomorrow at 9 a.m.? It should not be a phone call. It's going to take 15 minutes. There's not really much to gain from a phone call here as opposed to written communication. And then finally, we have introducing a new product to a customer. Probably going to be a balance of both. Okay, we're going to have some face-to-face discussion where we show them the product, we answer some questions. We're also going to have some written communication where we give them some more details, give them kind of a record of the information. Then we'll probably have some more face-to-face conversation where we'll follow up and see if there are any questions that need to be answered. So as you can see, different types of situations here call for different communication channels. Digital media channels are becoming very important to communication as well, and there's a variety of different reasons that we use different digital media channels. Sometimes they can be more cost effective because certain types of digital media, such as social media, don't have high costs associated with them. Okay, we can reach more people, email, web conferencing, social media. We can all get through to a lot more people there than we can via, say, in-person communication. All right, offers us a different type of interaction. There can be some more flexibility with digital media as well. Now here we have a list of some of the advantages and disadvantages of digital media in the workplace. And I'm not going to go through this list one by one, but I am going to focus on the disadvantages a little bit and talking through them. And the reason I'm going to do that is it's so very easy to get caught up in using digital media because it's easy, it's low cost, there's a variety of different reasons to do it, and sometimes we overuse it and use it in ways that we shouldn't. Okay, so a few of the things that we want to be careful about are that, one, when we use digital media, we're not communicating all the same types of information. Okay, people can't read our body language, can't see our facial expressions, so there's certain information that's not necessarily coming through the communication, and as a result, it may be a little more challenging to build trust. Okay. Also, when we're using social media in particular, it's really easy to kind of speed through something that we're doing. We can do this in email too, but it's very common in social media where we're working fast, we don't necessarily review our language the same way, and then we post something that's insensitive to other people. Okay, and by the time we realize it, the damage is already done, right? We've already hurt people that we didn't mean to hurt. So we need to be very careful that we review our language that we use in digital media so we're respectful of all people. Okay, and then finally, you want to make sure that you don't accidentally send out sensitive or private information to the wrong people. And if you're a fan of the TV show The Office, then you've probably seen the episode where Michael sends a picture to an entire group of people he didn't mean to send it to, and it gets through the entire company and causes a very embarrassing situation. Well, that type of thing can happen in real life too. Okay, imagine that you're going to send an email in your office and you have a John P. Smith and a John B. Smith in your office, and you happen to send it to the wrong John Smith. Or what could be even more confusing is you have a John B. Smith and just a John Smith. And you mean to be emailing John B. Smith, but John Smith pops up in that automatic Outlook sender, and you send it there. Okay, you got to be very careful about these types of things because you don't want to send information to the wrong people. Digital communication has the potential to increase our workload, so we have to take some steps to manage how we use digital communication. First, you have to separate what's important from what's routine. Okay, and I'm going to talk about folders here on your email in just a minute, but an example here would be I get emails from my organization almost weekly with updates on different things that rarely ever pertain directly to me. So I make sure I have folders that I put all these things into because I don't want to delete them in case there is something I need to know later on, but I recognize that I can quickly scan these, know if there's something important for me, and quickly move them out of my way. Okay? You also want to make sure you don't get into the habit of hitting reply all. All too often, an email goes out to a group, somebody hits reply all, another person hits reply all, and then everybody's inboxes are getting clogged up with information that they don't need. Now, as a sender, you can help to resolve this issue by not sending emails to a large group of people. Instead, send it to yourself and BCC everyone else. That way, even if somebody does hit reply all, it doesn't go to the entire group. Okay, I talked about creating email folders for routine messages. You can also create email folders for different subjects, priorities, senders, and that way when you have to go back to stuff, you can find it. Okay, it's very important to set this up early on in your email account because if you don't, this kind of gets away from you. Make sure you have people check your emails before you send them if they're non-routine, particularly if there's something in there that can be controversial or where you want to make sure you're using the right language to be inclusive or to be respectful of all people. Have someone else take a look before you send it because once you hit send, it is out there. Related to that, don't hit send unless you'd be comfortable with anyone in the world reading your email or reading your tweet or reading your post, whatever the case may be. Okay, and then finally, don't be afraid to disconnect. All right, there's no rule that says you have to have your email on your phone. This is becoming a little bit of a social norm, but you don't have to do it. You need to make a decision that's going to be right for you. I personally used to keep my email on my phone, and I actually removed it a few years ago when I realized that I was replying to emails while I was walking my dog. I was replying to emails at 11 o'clock at night, and as a result of this, I was kind of starting to not like my job. And I said, you know what? I want to like my job. I love what I do. And getting my email off my phone and finding a way to disconnect was a key component to me going back to loving my job. Digital communication has also strengthened our ability to allow remote work in the workplace. Okay, and we're seeing a lot more people working remotely these days, and obviously the COVID-19 pandemic helped to expedite that. And what we learned through this process, what we learned through the pandemic, is that people were fairly productive while working remotely. Okay, but we did have a lot of disconnect between coworkers that resulted from remote work. So we do need to make sure that we're using our digital technologies and our digital communication to help maintain connections when people are working remotely. Now, we discussed media richness earlier in this lesson. We're going to circle it back to it here real quick, just as we discussed what type of media we want to use for different types of messages. And when you have difficult or unusual messages, maybe you have to have a challenging performance discussion with somebody, or you've got to have a discussion with somebody about changing prices or something that they're not going to be all that happy with. You want to use a more rich media. This is where you want to talk to people face to face or via video conference. Okay, because you really need to be able to have a good back and forth where you have quick feedback. Okay, simple, more routine messages such as confirming a meeting time, maybe brief policy updates, those can come through less rich media such as emails or other types of notifications, letters, memos, things of that nature. And then when you have complex or important messages that are going to be a little more ongoing, we might use multiple media for these. Okay, so we might have some face-to-face conversations while also sending emails and then following up with video conferences and so on, and using different types of media with different levels of richness to support and complement each other. Now, effective communication skills don't just make you better at your job, but they also make you a more attractive job candidate. And on the next few slides, we're going to talk about a few different ways that you can work to improve your communication skills. Effective speaking skills help you become a good presenter, but they're not the only tool that you need. Okay, you need to make sure that if you're having two-way communication, that you're learning from each other and trying to find a shared solution. You need to make sure that you're authentic in presenting. I can tell you that as a presenter, one of the things that I find to be most helpful is to understand any potential objections that my audience is going to have and make sure that I address those objections early on so that I don't lose them early in the presentation. Okay, so I'll give you an example. I do a lot of work in leadership categorization theory. And what leadership categorization theory basically says is it says that we have different expectations for leaders. Okay, and these expectations that we have for leaders shape how we interpret a leader's behavior, they shape how we interpret a leader's performance, and so on and so forth. Okay, and when I use this theory, I use it a lot in areas of diversity and discrimination, looking at differential outcomes. So why do we evaluate leaders of one race differently from leaders of another race? And I recognize people are going to be resistant to this research because very few people want to acknowledge that they have been conditioned to have different expectations of leaders and that this conditioning results in potential discriminatory behavior. Okay, so I start by not even talking about people. I start by talking about animals, and I ask people, imagine a police dog, and I say, close your eyes, and I'm going to put one up on the board, and I put a picture of a kitten up, and then they open their eyes, and I say, is this what you imagined? And they say no, and then I show them a picture of a pug, and they say no, and then I show them a German Shepherd dog, and they say yes, and I say, okay, this is what we all think of when we think of a police dog. And then I move forward to a Rottweiler, and I say, but couldn't this be a police dog too? And they say, oh yeah, it could be. And right away, I've shown them, okay, you have been conditioned to expect one thing when I give you this label, and that one thing is not always accurate. Now, what if that happened with people? And they all of a sudden their eyes are like, oh my gosh, that could happen with people. And then I get into leadership categorization theory. And what I've done is I've kind of disarmed them. I've kind of taken away some of their objections because before they could get into the mindset of saying, I can't be conditioned, they acknowledge that they were conditioned, and they're more open to the discussion that's coming forth. Now, there are a lot of different areas that we can look to improve our writing skills. Okay, and we're not just talking about grammar and spelling, though these things are important. I've got a picture here of a book called Eats, Shoots, and Leaves, and I love this book because the basic concept of it is where we put our punctuation changes the meaning of sentences. So the phrase, a panda eats, shoots, and leaves, depending on where our commas are, could mean either a panda sits down and it eats the plants that we refer to as shoots and leaves, or it could mean that a panda walks into a place, shoots a gun, and then walks out. Okay, it all depends on where the punctuation goes. So we want to be very careful about how we structure our sentences and make sure that they are actually structured in a way that makes sense. There was actually a lawsuit recently that was won by a group of truckers because there was wording in a contract where a comma was not in the right place, and because of where this comma was located, the truckers were actually eligible for a whole bunch of overtime that they wouldn't have been eligible for if the comma had been located in a different place. Okay. You also want to make sure that when you send communication, it's not just about grammar, but are you giving a message that somebody can actually respond to effectively? I get messages from students via email that say things like, I'm pretty sure my attendance is wrong, can you fix it? And the email doesn't say why they think the attendance is wrong or what day they think they were in class that I didn't give them credit for. and there's really not much I can do with that. I have to send a follow-up email that basically says, can you give me more details? What day do you think you were in class, et cetera, et cetera. Another issue pertains to clarity. I had a colleague recently tell me that he was having some problems with his writing because people didn't think that his writing was clear. They couldn't understand his points. And he said, the points are so clear to me, but I don't understand why people aren't getting them. And I said, look, I need you to do this. I said, break down your writing, break down your story like you're going to tell it to a 5-year-old. Okay, very similar to what I did on the previous slide when I discussed leadership categorization theory and the kittens and the pugs and things like that, right? But I said, break it down like you're breaking it down for a 5-year-old, write it out for a 5-year-old. Now enhance it with the details that you need for a professional. Shortly after giving this advice, he said, wow, that was amazing advice. I did that and it worked. So make sure that you're clear in your writing as well. Use simple language and be concise with your writing. People are not going to read everything you write. They're going to skim, they're going to pay more attention to some areas than they do to others. And the more information you give them that they don't need in written communication, the greater the likelihood that they're going to focus on information that they don't need and not focus on the information that you do need them to focus on. So conciseness helps you avoid that problem. Finally, remember that sometimes words can have different meanings in different cultures, and cultural awareness can help you to understand all the potential meanings of language so that you can avoid using ambiguous phrases. Remember that your nonverbal signals matter too. Think about being on time to meetings. Okay, being late to meetings sends a message. It sends a message that this meeting wasn't important enough for me to show up on time. Think about your body language. Are you smiling? Are you making eye contact? Are you standing in a closed-off position with your arms crossed? All these things send messages to the people you're communicating with. But finally, remember that norms vary by culture. So a lot of these nonverbal signals don't mean the same thing in one culture that they do in another. So as you're interpreting nonverbal signals that somebody sends to you, remember that it may not be appropriate to interpret them within the framework of the norm of your culture. It's also important to work on becoming a good listener. And one way that we can become better listeners is by engaging in a process called reflection. And in reflection, we essentially listen to what the other person has to say, and then we restate it to confirm meaning. So you might say something like, oh, what I'm hearing from you is that when I don't listen to your ideas, I make you feel unvalued. And then the person you're speaking to says yes, and they might dive deeper into it. Okay, but reflection helps you, one, confirm that you are understanding what they're saying correctly, and two, it reaffirms for the speaker that you're listening to them. Okay, now there's a list of effective listening techniques on the right-hand side of this slide, and essentially there are two big themes across these techniques, and these themes are what I want you to take away here. The themes are, one, that you want to make sure that you remain focused on the conversation, be focused on the message that's being delivered, and two, be open-minded. We also can't overlook the importance of reading and observation. And reading mistakes can be really costly to organizations. I'm going to walk you through an example that I think you could probably relate to as to how this can happen. Have you ever started a class and you had to do some work and you weren't necessarily sure what it was you had to do on something, so you sent the professor an email and it took them like a couple days to get back to you, and you were really frustrated because you just wanted to do your work and this was holding you up and it was throwing off your whole schedule that you hadn't heard back from them, and they finally get back to you and they say, hey, take a look at page 3 of the syllabus, your question should be covered right there, and you go back and you read page 3 and you're like, oh yeah, that answered my question. And you lost all this time and you had all this frustration, and at the time you were kind of blaming it on the slow email, but the reality is that when you read the syllabus, you skimmed over it, or you weren't really paying attention, your mind was lost, and if you had just read a little more closely and paid a little better attention, you would have had the answer to your question days ago. That's an example of how reading mistakes can cause problems within our organizations. Okay, and then when it comes to observation, we can't undervalue observation. Recently, I had a colleague ask about collecting data at a site when I was going to be out there, and what we ended up agreeing on was, okay, I'm going to go out to this site, but we're not going to collect any data I'm just going to spend 4 days observing what goes on there so that we can come up with the best way to collect data that we possibly can. Because sometimes through observation, you get to understand an environment in a lot more depth than you do by hearing about it or reading about it. Next, we're going to talk in a little more detail about the types of communication that takes place within our organization and impacts our daily performance. Downward communication refers to communication that comes from upper levels of the organization to employees in lower levels of the organization. And often, this might be trying to provide them with news or direction about their job. Okay, there are some difficulties that can come from downward communication. One, we can send too much downward communication to our employees. Okay, I've seen people who are inundated with emails to the point that they're spending hours a day just reading downward communication. Also, sometimes this information is filtered, so employees see the version of the communication that upper management would like them to see, but they don't necessarily have all the information that's going to empower them to do their jobs to the best of their ability. Okay, one type of downward communication that's really important within organizations is coaching. And coaching occurs when we have someone at a higher level who is assigned to help develop an employee at a lower level, and they provide communication that is intended to help this person grow in their skills. Related to filtering, one of the challenges that we deal with downward communication in our organizations is that information gets lost. Now, this chart here may not have numbers that are applicable to every organization or every situation, but what you can see as we look at this example is that with each level of the organization that we go down, we've lost a portion of the information that we're trying to communicate, to the point that by the time we get to the workers at the bottom of the pyramid, we've lost 80% of the information that the board of directors was communicating. Now, upward communication, as you may expect, is communication that comes from lower levels of the organization to higher levels of the organization. And this can help management better understand what's going on that they can't see from their viewpoint. And you might be thinking, as a manager, how do I facilitate real upward communication? Because aren't people going to be afraid to tell me the truth? Well, you're 100% right. People might be afraid to tell you the truth. So there's only so much you can do, but there are a few things that you can do. You can have an open door policy. Okay, and that open door policy doesn't mean your door has to be open 40 or 50 hours a week, but maybe it's one day a week, or maybe it's certain hours during the day, and you make a point of making sure your door is open and that you're very receptive to people who come in and talk to you during this time. You can have town halls, and town hall is basically a meeting where people can come in and they can be anonymous, and we ask them some questions and we allow them to build off of each other. And there's different ways that you can facilitate a town hall to protect identity. So you may have somebody who's not the employee's manager facilitate the town hall. You may do something where the town hall is actually facilitated by an employee, and then the manager comes in and receives the feedback and then can ask follow-up questions. For me as a manager, one of the ways that I found was the best way to facilitate upward communication was simply to sit down and have coffee in the break room with people. Okay, because what I found out was that when I sat down and had coffee in the break room with people, they really opened up. And a lot of times people say, hey, you know what, Billy, this is going on. Do you know about this? And here I'm not really trying to work. They're not trying to work, but I'm learning a lot of information that I would have never learned if I hadn't been sitting down in that break room. Now, horizontal communication is just communication that occurs between people at similar levels or the same level within the organization. And horizontal communication is fairly common because a lot of times people at the same level of the organization need information from each other in order to effectively do their jobs. Sometimes they have conflict that they have to work through, and sometimes they just have to support each other through problems. Somebody may be struggling with a certain aspect of their job, somebody may have been reprimanded by a boss, and they may just need somebody to vent to. And a coworker at the same level within the organization often is somebody who is really good sounding board because they've been through a lot of the same things that you may have been through. Now, a lot of what we've talked about in this lesson refers to formal communication or the official management sanctioned communication within the organization. Okay, and as managers, we obviously have some control over that. But what we don't have control over is informal communication. We don't have control over the conversations that happen in the break room, the text messages that get passed, and so on and so forth. So what a lot of managers realize is that they need to communicate themselves in such a way that informal communication becomes less important. I used to work for a dean who would make good news announcements, he would make bad news announcements, he announced everything. And his philosophy was, I'm going to give you all the information that I possibly can because I don't want you filling in gaps with informal communication. Essentially, what he was trying to do is he was trying to make sure that he was our primary source of information so that he could shape the way we interpreted that information. Now, we've all heard Marvin Gaye sing about the grapevine, and if you haven't, I suggest you listen to it on Spotify. But basically, the grapevine that Marvin Gaye is singing about, while it's social in nature, is very similar to the grapevine within our organizations. Within our organizations, we have networks of people that communicate informally and help provide information that might help us do our jobs, might help us understand a little more about what's going on within the organization. But you want to be careful when you hear about things through the grapevine because not everything that you hear through the grapevine is always accurate. Often information that we hear through the grapevine can be biased based upon different people's perspectives or their motivations. Sometimes as managers, we're going to hear rumors within our organizations that could be potentially damaging to us, and we're going to want to ignore them because rumors are a pain. But the reality is we need to neutralize these rumors before they gain momentum and get out of hand and damage our relationships with our employees. But this can be challenging when there's constraints on what we can share. So let's imagine a situation where I fire an employee who was caught stealing. Okay, and I fire this person for stealing, and they're embarrassed, and they don't want to tell their friends they were stealing, so they say they found out that I was doing something unethical, and they were going to report me, and I fired them so they couldn't report me. Well, I can't go out and tell everybody that I caught this person stealing, because that's going to violate some HR policies. But what I can do is I can say stuff like, hey, I heard there's a rumor that somebody got fired recently because they caught me engaging in some unethical behavior. I want to give you an opportunity to share your concerns about this, but I also have some concerns that I'd like to share, and I want to make sure that you know how unrealistic this is. Okay, and I'm not saying it's unrealistic because I'm this great and fabulous person. I'm saying it's unrealistic because firing somebody for something like that would be the most sure way that I could get caught. Because why in the world wouldn't they report me, right? They have nothing to lose. They've already been fired. So this is obviously a ridiculous rumor, but I'd like you to have an opportunity to share your concerns. And what I've done here is I've kind of gotten ahead of this, and I've kind of made sure that people understand, you know what, that really doesn't make any sense, but I haven't actually violated any rules related to confidentiality. And ultimately, if we want our employees to trust the information that we're giving them, we need to be transparent. And that means that we're accurately sharing relevant information, whether or not it's positive or negative. Okay, and this is going to help us build a boundaryless organization, one where people get the information that they need as they need it and can do their jobs effectively and efficiently because of our transparency with information. And that's it for this lesson on communication. Thanks so much for joining me. This is Billy Obenauer saying I hope you enjoyed it, hope you learned something, and we'll talk to you soon.